I spent weeks perfecting the role of my paralyzed twin to save my company, but I didn't realize I was being set up as the face of a massive organized scheme that would leave me facing an accusation for an enormous term. One wrong move, and the specialist at my bedside would ensure I spent dozens of years paying for crimes I didn't commit. The polished marble floors of the estate always felt cold, even through the thick, expensive soles of my loafers. I hated this house. I hated the silence that swallowed sound, broken only by the rhythmic, shallow breathing coming from the custom-made medical bed dominating the West Wing drawing room. That breathing belonged to my twin brother, Julian, and for the last 3 weeks it was my breathing too. My real life was chaos, a chaotic, thriving tech startup in San Francisco. Julian's life was a perfectly preserved, gilded cage. 2 years ago, a skiing accident, a freak twist of fate that left him, and by extension, me, his identical shadow, a quadriplegic dependent on 24-hour care. Except Julian wasn't just paralyzed, he was paranoid. He didn't trust anyone who hadn't passed his bizarre, multi-layered vetting process. That's where I came in. "Ethan," he'd rasped over the secure line a month ago, his voice thin from the hospital bed he'd insisted on bringing home. "The final hurdle. I can't meet the new caregiver face to face until I know they're trustworthy. You have to be me. You have to be paralyzed." The sheer audacity of the request should have made me refuse, but Julian controls the family trust, the one thing preventing my startup from collapsing under debt while scaling. So I agreed to play the role of the helpless millionaire for 1 week, just until the new specialist, a woman named Dr. Lena Petrova, signed off. I'd spent days practicing. The facial expressions, the vacant stare, the slight tremor in the unused muscles, the utter dependence. It was exhausting. Now I was confined to the massive, motorized wheelchair, a state-of-the-art piece of medical equipment that Julian himself had engineered to monitor vital signs. My hands rested stiffly on the armrests, programmed to respond only to specific voice commands or the slight pressure of the monitoring gloves I had to wear. Today was the test. Lena Petrova was due at noon. The staff, the cook, the driver, the physical therapist who came thrice weekly, they all knew I was Julian. They'd signed ND as thick enough to stop small-caliber projectiles. They'd been sworn to silence about the subtle differences in our mannerisms, the slight way I clenched my jaw when stressed, the way Julian always favored his left side even when immobile. The tension in the drawing room was palpable. I was staring at the ceiling, forcing my breathing to remain slow and even, just like the monitors indicated Julian's should be. My actual heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. A quiet chime echoed through the house. The front door. Then footsteps. Measured, confident, utterly unlike the shuffling anxiety of the previous temporary hires. The door to the drawing room slid open. "Mr. Hawthorne?" A voice smooth as dark chocolate cut through the silence. "I'm Dr. Petrova. Forgive my slight delay. Traffic on the North Drive was unexpectedly dense." I couldn't speak. Julian's vocal cords were supposed to be too weak for casual conversation. I managed a nearly imperceptible nod, focusing on keeping my eyes slightly unfocused, conveying the profound exhaustion of chronic immobility. Lena stepped into my line of sight. She was taller than I expected, severe in a crisp, white lab coat, but her eyes, they were the color of glacial ice, sharp and assessing. She didn't rush. She walked slowly around the wheelchair, her gaze lingering on the complex wiring connecting the chair to the wall ports. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Julian," she said, her tone professional, but carrying an odd undercurrent of sympathy. She pulled a small digital tablet from her coat. "I've reviewed all your diagnostics. Remarkable resilience." She spent the next hour running tests, checking reflexes that weren't there, monitoring muscle engagement through the electronic sensors I was forced to wear beneath my specialized silk pajamas. Everything was calibrated to Julian's current state. If I flinched, if my pulse spiked more than 3 beats above resting rate during a painful stretch simulation, The chair's internal system would log it as a potential stress indicator, which Lena was watching in real time on her tablet. I was nailing it. Every calculated twitch, every slow blink, every labored syllable I managed to force out when asked a direct question, "Can you hear me, Julian?" seemed to satisfy her. Then she stopped the examination. She leaned in close, her breath warm near my ear, her eyes locking onto mine. "The initial reports indicated significant residual nerve activity in your upper left forearm, Julian," she murmured, her voice dropping so low I almost missed it. "A slight, involuntary flexing when you are exposed to sudden, sharp noises, a very specific pattern." My blood ran instantly cold. Julian had told me about the nerve issues, but he'd emphasized they were completely dormant now. "I think," she continued, standing upright again, her expression returning to neutral professionalism, "that perhaps you aren't entirely paralyzed, Mr. Hawthorne. Or at the very least, your twin brother is doing a truly exceptional job of imitating you." And before I could even attempt to simulate the panic that should have seized a man suddenly accused of such an elaborate deception, her hand snapped out, not toward my arm, but toward the hidden emergency release latch on the side of the motorized wheelchair, the very latch that would override the paralysis simulation and immediately lock the chair into full mobility mode, revealing me as perfectly able-bodied. Her fingers were already closing around the cool metal. Time dissolved. In the split second it took for her fingertips to brush the release mechanism, every cell in my body screamed, "Danger." My rehearsed immobility shattered. Instinct, the raw, panicked instinct of self-preservation, took over the carefully constructed facade. I couldn't move my arms under the monitoring gloves, but Julian had built one fail-safe into the chair's operating system, a backdoor I was only supposed to use in case of a genuine electrical fire or medical catastrophe. It was a purely auditory command, designed to sound like a death rattle, a sound so guttural and sudden it would shock anyone nearby. "G-g-ga!" The sound tore from my throat, not the weak rasp Julian used, but a full-bodied, terrifying roar of agony that echoed off the marble. It was so loud, so completely inconsistent with my supposed condition, that Lena recoiled instantly, jerking her hand back from the release latch as if burned. The massive chair reacted violently. The stabilization gyros whined loudly as the system momentarily short-circuited, interpreting the auditory spike as a critical systemic failure. The chair lurched forward half an inch before the lockdown protocols reasserted themselves. Lena stared at me, her glacial eyes widening for the first time. She wasn't looking at a patient. She was looking at a threat, or maybe looking at the proof of her suspicion. "What was that?" she demanded, her professional mask slipping, replaced by raw confusion mixed with alarm. She backed away 2 steps, her hand now hovering near the emergency alert button she wore on her wristband. I couldn't speak again. I was trembling violently, the simulation entirely ruined. I needed to sell the trauma, the shock, the sudden neurological event. I focused every ounce of concentration on the right index finger, the one Julian had a tiny, almost imperceptible residual twitch in. I forced the muscle to fire, a microscopic spasm against the pressure sensors of the glove. Beep, beep, beep. The chair registered the input. A green light flashed on the console, a sign of minor, non-critical neurological activity. Lena visibly relaxed, but her suspicion was a physical presence in the room now. She lowered her hand from the alert button. A seizure response? Severe auditory shock, perhaps. Mr. Hawthorne, that was extraordinary. You need immediate sedation if you can have reactions like that. She knelt beside me again, her face closer this time, but her approach was different. She wasn't assessing a paralyzed man anymore. She was circling a cornered animal. "I think you are right, doctor," I managed to choke out, pushing my voice into Julian's weak register, layering it over the residual adrenaline shock. Painful episode. Just a residual trauma response. "I see," she said, though I knew she didn't. She was playing along, buying time. "I will adjust your evening protocol. I need to review the raw data logs from the chair." She stood and tapped commands into her tablet. Her back briefly turned toward me as she accessed the chair's secure diagnostics port embedded in the base. This was my only chance. I had 3 seconds. I remembered Julian mentioning that the environmental controls in the drawing room, the temperature, the humidity, the air pressure, were all managed via a low-frequency sonic emitter hidden in the grandfather clock in the hall, calibrated to mimic Julian's preferred sterile hospital environment. If I could disrupt that frequency, I might cause enough localized chaos to mask my next move. I found the word. It wasn't a command, but a trigger Julian had built into the wheelchair's voice activation. A single sharp, nonverbal sound that bypassed the primary vocalizer and sent a localized electromagnetic pulse through the chair's external sensors, designed to temporarily scramble nearby low-power electronics. "Hass-sass-sass!" I hissed, forcing the air over my tongue. The effect was immediate. The lights in the room flickered violently. The overhead projector displaying Julian's vital signs sputtered and died, and the elegant grandfather clock in the hallway emitted a sharp, high-pitched crack. The digital readout on Lena's tablet went black. She spun around, fury momentarily replacing her icy calm. "What in God's name?" That was the window. My hands were still restrained by the monitoring gloves, but the EMP had briefly overloaded the magnetic locks holding the gloves onto the chair's armrests. I yanked my left hand upward with desperate force. The magnetic clasp shattered with a tiny snap. My fingers were free, clumsy but functional. I didn't waste time trying to free the other hand. Instead, I drove my now unrestricted hand forward, aiming not at Lena, but at the massive, custom-built glass display case across the room. Inside that case, under triple reinforced glass, sat Julian's prized possession, a small antique wooden puzzle box rumored to contain the original deeds to half the family's European holdings. I slammed my elbow against the base of the wheelchair, propelling myself forward in a jarring, uncontrolled lurch that sent sparks briefly flying from the exposed wiring. I didn't stop until the chair slammed into the display case with bone-jarring force. The reinforced glass spider-webbed but didn't break. "Stop this!" Lena screamed, abandoning all pretense of calm. She lunged toward me, pulling a small pressurized canister from her coat pocket. It looked too small for pepper spray, too metallic for anything benign. I looked down at my free hand, then back at the fracturing glass, realizing I couldn't smash it in time. Then my gaze fell upon the heavy, ornate silver letter opener resting on the antique desk just inches away from the chair's trajectory. I kicked out violently with my right foot, the one entirely unresponsive during the simulation, but now fueled by pure adrenaline. The kick caught the desk leg, rocking the heavy mahogany surface just enough. The letter opener slid. Lena was upon me, her movements too fast, too practiced. She pressed the nozzle of the canister against my neck, right where the carotid artery pulsed furiously. "If you move one more time, I inject you with enough paralyzing agent to stop a horse, whoever you are," she hissed. But I had the letter opener now. My fingers closed around the cold silver handle. I brought the tip up, aiming for the pressure point on her wrist controlling the canister. I didn't know what was in that can, and I couldn't afford to find out. I lunged, a desperate, clumsy motion born of terror and fake paralysis, while she squeezed the nozzle, and I felt a sudden sharp sting on my jaw, followed instantly by the chilling sensation of cold liquid soaking into my skin as the letter opener sliced across her inner wrist. She gasped, dropping the canister as blood immediately bloomed on her immaculate white coat. As she staggered back, clutching her bleeding arm, I felt a strange lightness spread from my jaw, a dizzying numbness that crept down my neck, and then the world tilted violently. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Lena Petrova, leaning against the wall, a triumphant, terrifying smile spreading across her face, while the paralyzing agent I thought was meant for her began to take effect on me. The darkness wasn't empty. It was a roaring tunnel of sound and pressure, all originating from my own body as the paralyzing agent did its work. It wasn't the quick total shutdown I'd expected, but a slow, creeping paralysis starting at my extremities and creeping inward. My free hand, the one holding the silver letter opener, seized up first, the silver clattering uselessly onto the marble floor. I tried to scream, to activate the emergency distress beacon on the chair, but the muscles governing my jaw were already locked. I was Julian again, trapped inside a body that refused to obey, but I knew the difference now. This wasn't Julian's chronic affliction. This was fast-acting, weaponized incapacitation. Lena hadn't been treating a patient. She had been running security clearance. When my vision swam back into focus, the first thing I registered was the sound of a heavy boot stepping over my inert body. Lena was kneeling beside the chair, her wrist bleeding sluggishly but her eyes now burning with professional satisfaction, the mask completely gone. "Impressive reaction time, Ethan," she said, her voice dripping with an irony that curdled my blood. "But Julian's fail-safes are far more sophisticated than you imagined. That EMP pulse you triggered didn't disable nearby electronics. It overloaded the chair's internal sensor grid, signaling an unauthorized user attempting manual override. My injection wasn't a paralytic, Ethan. It was a localized neurosuppressant that targets muscular response patterns inconsistent with the primary user profile, Julian's profile." She pressed a button on the wheelchair console, and the armrest snapped shut around my inert hands with cold, mechanical finality. "You failed the test," she stated simply. "You panicked, you broke protocol, and you attacked a contracted medical professional. Julian suspected something was amiss when you didn't recoil from the mention of the nerve twitch last week. He knew you wouldn't remember the specifics of his dormant condition, only the general file notes. He needed confirmation you weren't him." A low whirring sound preceded the opening of the safe hidden behind the tapestry near the fireplace. Out stepped an older gentleman, frail, impeccably dressed, and moving with the slow, careful deliberation of someone unused to exerting himself. Julian, my identical twin, sitting up in his bed, looking suddenly stronger, sharper, utterly healthy. The paralysis was a costume. "Ethan," Julian whispered, his voice rich and strong, a terrifying echo of my own, "you always lacked patience." The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. The accident hadn't happened to Julian, it had happened to me. I was the one who went skiing 2 years ago. Julian, the calculating one, the true strategist, had swapped places with me in the hospital, perhaps even orchestrated the accident after I signed over power of attorney during a moment of weakness. He had kept me locked in this room, playing the role of the paralyzed twin for 2 years while he lived my life, using my identity to run the company while I was subjected to endless, pointless medical evaluations, waiting for the final security check. "Lena isn't a caregiver," Julian continued, leaning forward slightly in his bed. "She's my liaison with the organization that handles sensitive personnel transfers. She was vetting whether the family trust could be fully transferred to me without any disruptive input from you. Congratulations, Ethan. You've proven you are still capable of fighting, but you are completely unprepared for the reality of this situation." He nodded toward Lena. She produced a syringe, this one large, filled with a clear liquid. "The good news," Julian said, a cruel smile twisting his lips, "is that your fighting spirit confirms the quality of my initial investment. The bad news is that the legal paperwork is ironclad. Once the final signature is witnessed, and I assure you I have the perfect setup now that you are incapacitated, the entirety of Hawthorne Industries will be mine, along with the offshore accounts." I watched, helpless and numb, as Lena approached. But as she reached my shoulder, a single unexpected sound broke the silence. Beep, beep, beep. It wasn't the chair's distress signal. It was coming from the pocket of the silk pajamas I was wearing, pajamas I thought were just an expensive costume detail. Julian hadn't mentioned them. Julian froze. "What is that?" Lena checked her tablet, which she had managed to reboot. "A proximity alert, low-frequency military-grade tracking device, unauthorized deployment within the estate perimeter." Julian's face drained of color. "That's impossible. I deactivated all external tracking on the estate after I was confined." The front door burst open, not with the polite chime, but with the violent splintering of wood. A squad of heavily armed men wearing tactical gear unmarked by any official insignia stormed into the room. They moved with brutal efficiency, ignoring the medical equipment and heading straight for Julian's bed. "It was never about the trust, was it?" One of the men barked, leveling a weapon at Julian's chest. "It was about the data." Lena shrieked, scrambling for the empty canister, but she was too slow. The lead operative leveled a hard glare at the helpless me in the wheelchair. "Don't worry, Mr. Hawthorne," the operative said, his voice gravelly. "Your brother's elaborate scheme to fake injury and conceal those misappropriated schematics was clever. But he underestimated your tech skills. You thought you were playing a paralyzed man, but you were actually running a deep-cover data siphon for us. The constant monitoring you endured? It just provided the perfect conduit for us to download the financial transfer logs you've been gathering for the past 2 years." He looked at Julian, who was shaking violently, his facade of health dissolving into sheer terror. "The debt repayment is due, Mr. Hawthorne. We're here to collect." The operative snapped his fingers. 2 men grabbed Julian, ripping him from the bed that hadn't been designed for a quadriplegic, but for a man staging a dramatic convalescence. As they dragged the sputtering, protesting Julian out of the room, Lena stood paralyzed, the supposed security expert utterly outmaneuvered. The lead operative walked over to me, then knelt down. He didn't check the paralysis or the neurosuppressant. He simply reached into the pocket of my pajamas and pulled out a tiny black memory card, the actual tracking device, now blinking with an all-clear signal. "Your brother's final test was our green light," the operative explained calmly, tucking the card away. "We needed you to convince him you were too broken to fight back. Enjoy the company of your actual twin, Mr. Hawthorne. We hear the local penitentiary has excellent amenities for those facing multiple counts of serious financial fraud and attempted kidnapping." He stood up, nodded once, and followed his team out, leaving me strapped into the wheelchair, still numb, but now, suddenly, profoundly free. The silence returned, but this time, it was a silence of victory, broken only by the sound of the front door slamming shut, finally closing on Julian's gilded cage.